Hello and welcome back to this damn fatalistic crusade. This video is a review of the 1927 silent masterpiece, The Cat and the Canary, which was the first American film to be directed by the legendary Paul Leni, who of course should be a bigger name but unfortunately died at far too young of an age and only completed 4 films in the United States when he was brought over to work for Universal. This is also the first title to be released by the wonderful Eureka label with their new US distribution arm here. So this is a release that's available in the US as a Region A Blu-ray in addition to the standard Eureka Region B release. So this is the first Eureka disc that you don't have to import. It's part of their initial slate of releases. So now they're going to be doing US releases, and I suppose maybe some that will be specifically US releases, just like the Indicator label started doing a little while ago as well. I am truly glad that Eureka decided to lead with a major title and acquisition for their Masters of Cinema line to launch their US division. The Cat and the Canary is one of the silent films that is so incredibly important that when you see it for the first time, it will feel incredibly familiar because so much of what it does has entered into the pop culture lexicon, has become so ingrained that virtually all the elements that were new and fresh in the 1920s of what is essentially the haunted house genre, it's now been done to death so many times or referenced or spoofed so many times that practically everything is a cliche of sorts. But you have to put yourself in the mindset of the 1920s and the fact that these types of plays took over Broadway, took Broadway by storm, essentially, starting with The Bat in 1920 and then The Cat and the Canary in 1922. It took a few years to get to this film version, but a lot of these plays did start to see various film adaptations in both the silent and sound era. And The Cat and the Canary would see several remakes over the years, even some by Universal as sound films. But The Cat and the Canary is where it all seems to solidify in a way. And this is actually a quite interesting adaptation of the original stage play because they had to, of course, translate some things and worry about runtime. And so the actual play does have a little bit more detail and some of the events are in different order. So it's fascinating to look at even how this was adapted from the stage play, which is still revived to this day, and you can freely read it online if you wish to, and you should. But what the actual storyline does with the sort of cast of kooky characters in a spooky mansion and all the hijinks that go across one night of time, it's playing around with concepts and ideas that have become incredibly familiar. When you see this film the first time, the fascinating aspect is this is the first time where all of these elements really start to not only come together, but the film itself is actually alive. And it's the atmosphere and the experience of this film that really make it immortal, far more than it being the best and the best film version of one of the haunted house stage plays of the 1920s. Before you get into anything else about the film, the absolutely beyond striking thing is that this was Paul Leni's debut in the US. Being able to use the technology and equipment and sets and studios of Hollywood at Universal, and he was essentially hired to come out to Universal after the success of his German film Waxworks, which is unbelievably phenomenal and, of course, a great work of German expressionism. So this is another sort of big name of German expressionism brought over to the U.S., who made a string of unbelievable masterpieces, at least of what we have that survives, and then unfortunately died much too young, and sadly, much like F.W. Murnau. Leni is not a name that's talked about much outside of silent film circles or horror circles, because when you get into the realms of classic horror, there's a few sort of names that pop up a lot and a couple precursor films that pop up a lot, and of those, Paul Leni and The Cat and the Canary are just about top of the list. If you know anything about the development of the Universal horror cycle or the build-up to actually making Dracula as the first official supernatural horror film in 1931, you'll know the name Paul Leni, and you'll know a bit about The Cat and the Canary, because without question, this is the film that sets the template and the style for the Universal canon to come of the horror films. This has beautiful sets designed by Charles D. Hall, who would go on to design the sets for all the Universal horrors in terms of the 1930s Gothic films. This film was an enormous influence on James Whale, who adored its blending of horror and comedy with quirky characters, and essentially gigantic portions of The Old Dark House are essentially a love letter to this film, including the famous shot of the prowling camera going down the spooky hallway of the mansion with the billowing curtains, and there, of course, being a great storm at night outside. So if you love the quirky style of The Old Dark House and that sense of the macabre and the blending of horror and comedy with a bunch of complete eccentric nutballs inside of a spooky old house, The Cat and the Canary is what Whale was paying homage to throughout. There's even a few other shots in the film where it's quite obvious that Whale was definitely tipping his hat. But with a story that's so relatively straightforward, and it's a concept that's been done to death, when you come to this film, you might think that it's going to be simple. It's a silent film from 1927. It's a German director directing for the first time in Hollywood. There was a language barrier. You would think that it's not going to be a silent film that is as expressive with its usage of the medium, and you would be dead wrong, because this is one of the most vividly alive silent films that we have. This is full-bore expressionism mixed with a sense of the macabre and just absolutely peppered throughout with humor. And if you've seen Leni's previous film Waxworks, which Eureka has also released a beautiful Blu-ray of, you can actually get a sense, I think, of at least some of the elements that would come to fruition fully and made obvious in The Cat and the Canary. And also, he had the benefit of working at Universal and getting to play around with the full equipment of a studio, and seemed delighted to do so. It's all throughout the film. The film has an energy. Again, when I say this film is alive, it is so vividly alive that it almost feels like it's actually breathing. The camera prowls around Charles D. Hall's incredible set, and Leni himself had actually started as a painter and then was a set designer. So he was the type of person to involve himself in everything. So this is very much an auteur work, if you want to apply that label. And you definitely should, because Leni was that type of visionary. There's not one element of this film that doesn't have his stamp on it. And there's such a sense of glee as well, in addition to creating this incredible atmosphere. And it's the tone and the energy and the spirit of The Cat and the Canary that makes the film truly work and injects that energy into the events that are going on. And it starts to sort of raise the overall energy in the room, and you can sense that seeping into the actors and their performances. And as the night progresses, as our characters become increasingly unglued over the 12 hours that they're stuck here, and things get progressively worse and worse and worse, and people disappear and the corpses start turning up, you can feel the energy growing and changing and deftly moving between horrific elements, straight comedy, and then blending those two together. And all the while, it's the moving camera. It's the sense of there's a will, there's an intelligence behind all of this, and you feel it, and that's what involves you. That's what makes the film timeless. It makes it feel modern, because this is a film that is so visually alive. Again, the camera not only is completely untethered, it not only prowls everywhere, but you've got endless amounts of creative usage of angles everywhere, like you wouldn't believe. They of course did they even did what is famously usually attributed to Citizen Kane, where they actually, to get particular extremely low angles with the heavy Mitchell cameras they were using, they actually dug holes in the studio floor to then put the camera on the giant mount down in said holes, just to get these incredibly expressive low angles. This is nothing in this film was your average run-of-the-mill type production at Universal. And even compared to some of their silent classics, it's so far ahead in terms of visual stylization, energy, usage of the cinematic medium. Leni basically came over and was already in a class by himself, and he would prove this time and time again. Unfortunately, he was only able to make 4 films in the U.S. before he died, again, at a far too young age, if I believe 44 years old. And at least we have 3 of them surviving. One of them being The Man Who Laughs, which is not only a silent masterpiece, but one of the truly great legendary silent films that should be better seen in a beautiful restoration from Eureka. And they've also released a beautiful Blu-ray from the restoration of Leni's, unfortunately, last film in the U.S., The Last Warning, which also features the star and lead actress of this film, Laura LaPlante, who was one of Universal's biggest female stars at the time. Most tantalizingly, the one Leni film that is not known to survive, that is lost, that I truly hope turns up someday because I am dying to see it. In 1927, he directed an adaptation of the second Charlie Chan novel, The Chinese Parrot. So that is one of the early attempts at bringing Earl Durbigger's legendary character to the screen. And I've read the novel, and I would pay a ridiculous amount of money to see what Paul Leni did with that book as a film adaptation after The Cat and the Canary. I mean, that is for me one of the lost silent films that I am just beside myself. I hope I get to see it at some point in my lifetime if it's discovered. But had Leni survived longer, he very likely would have directed Dracula in 1931. He was pretty much top of the short list, and there was nobody else at Universal as qualified to tackle the same subject matter. And with this film and elements of his other films for Universal working in the sort of burgeoning Universal horror style. Of course, there had been the iconic Lon Chaney Sr. Masterworks in The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Phantom of the Opera that are starting to help further build the foundation of what will become Universal horror, but it's really Paul Leni coming into the picture, starting on The Cat and the Canary, that really does it, because you can recognize in the Chaney characters in Hunchback and Phantom that, there's they're basically forerunners of some of the characters in the Universal horror films, but you start watching The Cat and the Canary and it's there. It's there, but in terms of atmosphere, in terms of the set designs, again, Charles D. Hall is one of the great set designers in history, and the set for the old, dilapidated, haunted mansion in The Cat and the Canary is one of those so incredibly realized sets that it just feels like a real place. It really feels like you are there with these characters on this one particularly very stressful evening. But there's just so much of the Universal horror canon that would not exist without Paul Leni and would not exist without what he started in this film. And of course, the crew were all Universal men, and they went on into working on the Universal horror films. And there's even another connection, because this film was quite successful, and Universal did actually remake it in 1930 as a talkie, which was retitled The Cat Creeps. Unfortunately, this is a lost film as well, which I just would give anything to see this too, just to be able to compare them. But they also did a simultaneously shot Spanish language version, directed by George Melford and starring Lupita Tovar, both of which would go on into the Spanish language version of Dracula, which thankfully survives. But unfortunately, the Spanish language version of The Cat Creeps is lost as well, so we can only read about it. But that same sort of that same sort of paradigm, it's the same equation as Dracula a year later, so you can see even further connections. But again, had Paul Leni lived longer, I would say it's probably about 90% likely he would have directed Dracula. It's thought that Todd Browning was only hired because the studio had hoped to hire or lure Lon Chaney Sr. away from MGM, but unfortunately, Chaney died before any of that could even be discussed. And there were many people sort of named or thought about for Dracula, one of which was Conrad Veidt, who would have made an amazing Dracula, and one can very easily see a Conrad Veidt as Dracula directed by Paul Leni, especially after their staggering collaboration in The Man Who Laughs from 1928. So had Paul Leni lived longer, had the Chaney situation worked out the way it did, or they just didn't even bother with that, I would say it's extraordinarily likely that Paul Leni would have directed Dracula and the whole universal horror story, and thus the horror genre in motion pictures would be dramatically different in certain areas. And it's just one of those fascinating what ifs to consider, how that would have changed certain elements or maybe furthered the expressionist elements that Leni had put in his films. But it's unfortunate that he died so young, and we only have really, there were only 4 films, of which we only have 3, but the 3 we have are just unbelievable, incredible masterworks of artistic genius. They are truly striking works of the silent medium. And The Cat and the Canary is, again, it's one of the great American debuts of somebody coming to Hollywood and making their first picture, and it being this incredibly vivid and showing this level of not only understanding, but utilizing the cinematic medium to such an extent that the film itself feels like another character. The film itself feels like it's a living, breathing thing. And that's why the star of this film is Paul Leni. The reason why this film is magic is Paul Leni. It's not just that this is the bedrock of universal horror, which it is. That's not overstating it. You can't overstate that. But it's just endlessly creative, endlessly alive, endlessly energetic. It's a perfect gateway to silent films for those who have never seen a silent film or who have never gotten into silent films. And the sort of ideas of the plot are so known across the world in terms of what are termed cliches now that if you're not into silent films, it's kind of you're in, because you know the sort of bones of the story plot. You know sort of the setup and what could potentially happen. But even knowing the sort of cliches of the haunted house genre doesn't prepare you for stepping into The Cat and the Canary for the first time. This is the type of film that once you see it, when someone mentions the title, you smile. It is just so endlessly energetic and exciting and fun. It is an effortless blend of the horror and comedy elements, and of course was famously remade in 1939 in the version starring Bob Hope with Paulette Goddard, which was so successful it got a sequel of its own, The Ghostbreakers, which is loosely based on the Ghostbreaker play that was a precursor to the 1920 stage plays. That actually dates back even further. But that 1939 remake of The Cat and the Canary, it sort of reformulated the story and tweaked it for a 1939 audience who by that point were already sort of noticing the sort of inherent cliches of all of the haunted house mystery genre plays and films that had come out in the 1920s. So even by the late 30s, it was already kind of seen as old hat, and so they had to sort of, increase the comedy or sort of make fun of certain elements or play it more for laughs, which the 1939 film does, and it's still a classic in its own right, but it's not alive in the way that the 1927 film is. Few films are, to be honest. There was also a very interesting remake in the 1970s, which has some unique elements and shows that this story never really dies. But the central plot, if it was seen as old hat in 1939, Well, nowadays it would be seen as nothing but cliches. However, there's a certain charm in that too, and knowing that the finale is going to end a certain way. It ties the film in with classical mystery stories of unmasking the killer, and most of all, this is essential for Scooby Doo fans because so much of the DNA of the iconic and classic Scooby Doo story structure is it was solidified by the Cat and the Canary, and specifically here in the 1927 film adaptation. So there had been many haunted house mystery plays and stuff that could be associated with the genre in the teens and 20s, but the Cat and the Canary is where they all kind of come together. And here in the film adaptation, with the complete utilization of the cinematic medium, it's just a sort of watershed lightning in a bottle moment for this particular genre. And so the easiest way to sell this film, I would say, for those who would not consider themselves fans or interested in silent films, is that not only is this really one of the true precursors to the Scooby-Doo formula, but this is without question the foundation, the bedrock, the heart and core that started what became the Universal horror canon. Without this film, Dracula would not be the same, and thus all the Universal horror films would not be the same. And it's just a shame that Paul Leni died as young as he did, because there's no telling what he would have done in the 1930s, whether he did direct Dracula or other Universal horrors or not at all. But being who he was and being at Universal, I can't see him not jumping all over the horror films. Now, to talk about the plot a little bit, again, this will seem extraordinarily familiar if you've ever seen anything in the sort of haunted house realm, or even a Scooby-Doo episode. Old Man Cyrus West is a rich man who has an entire family who is basically waiting for him to kick the bucket so they can inherit his millions. And he's been essentially driven insane by them sort of waiting for him to die and trying anything desperately to get his money. And that, of course, is one of the meanings of the title, because he feels like a canary being surrounded by a bunch of cats. And this is even beautifully symbolized in the opening of the film, which wastes no time in going into full expressionist mode and using the visual medium to reflect the energy and the sense of wicked, macabre black humor that is what the film runs off of. Even the opening title sequence is full of this, and so simple and eloquent, with just a hand wiping away dust and cobwebs to reveal the title. But essentially, after the beautiful opening titles and sequence of Old Man Cyrus West deciding he was going to leave everything in his will that must not be opened until 20 years after his death. So he dies, and 20 years later, the house has stood and fallen more and more into disrepair. Everything's covered in dust, and the camera starts prowling around, almost as if it's the ghost of Old Man Cyrus himself going around his old lodgings. And we see a mysterious figure breaking into a safe and seeing or looking into what the actual sealed will was. Then the lawyer comes along, and all the family members and relatives are gathered, both older and younger, more distant relatives. And the will is opened and read, and everything is left to the youngest and most distant relative, Annabelle, played by the lead Laura LaPlante. And she's inherited all these millions, much to the jealousies of everyone around her, who has seemingly either schemed for the money for years, or thought of all the things they were going to do with it, or hold all of this, all of these grudges against Old Man Cyrus. Or there's, of course, the ones who seem like they're not too interested, and you don't quite know the motivations of all the characters, which comes into play later on, because of course there is one little stipulation that the lawyer reads, and that stipulation is, I guess, essentially due to Old Man Cyrus being driven insane and being worried about sanity, he decrees he has left Annabelle all of this money, provided that she can be proven sane. And so that means, of course, if she is proven insane, then someone else gets all the money, and that's in a separate sealed envelope, which the lawyer even says that he knows has been opened by someone, which means that Annabelle may come to harm. If that were not enough, everyone has to spend the night in the old mansion after the reading of the will, and when you see the lady of the house, known as Mammy Pleasant, incredibly played by Martha Maddox, as essentially a proto Mrs. Danvers, if ever there was one, who just radiates ill will and creepiness without even batting an eyelid. She simply moves and glides through the house as if she's just part of it, and expects to have conversations with spirits, which she claims to anyway, particularly of Old Man Cyrus. Her character in and of itself is enough to give anyone pause, but then spending the rest of the night in this house is yet another. And then if that were not enough, suddenly they are confronted by a guard from a nearby institution who is there looking for an escaped maniac killer who likes to go about dressed as a cat. So he is actually known as the Cat, and he just likes to kill people that way. So now he's going around looking for this escaped maniac murderer, and just so happens to be nice enough to let them know what he's up to. So now there's an escaped maniac killer somewhere on the grounds, potentially, as well. Our cast of characters in this mansion are a variety of different types, and you can see how this would be translated time and time again into other haunted house stories, where you usually have to have a sort of cross-section of different types of people. So you have the older women, you have the young heroine who's a little bit on the passive side and just continually getting freaked out more and more. You have the various other characters who you do have to sort of question their motives, and some will be more of your typical red herring type characters. For genre fans, Arthur Edmund Carew plays one of our band of relatives, and he just even, without having any major scenes, is such a presence that one can view him as quite easily possibly having nefarious things in mind. And he would go on to many other genre credits, most notably in the two-color Technicolor pre-code horror classics, Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum, of which Dr. X, in a way, is sort of a locked room haunted house horror film in at least the second and third acts of that film. So again, you can even feel the connection going there. But it's Creighton Hale as Paul Jones, the would-be leading man or hero of the story. That's quite an interesting performance and characterization, because they also give the character essentially what looks like a pair of glasses to make him look more like Harold Lloyd. The Jones character is very ineffectual, very nice and shy and awkward and not good around people, obviously cares for Annabelle, and is the only one of the group who's happy that she's going to get all the money, even though he's sad he didn't get any. It doesn't bother him as much as the others, essentially. But he's a very ineffectual character. He is scared or traumatized by a lot of things, but there's also a lot of psychological depth there, because it's not a buffoon character. It's not a character who's entirely played for laughs, because there are flashes of resolve in there, and in spite of some of the goofier things he does, in the final act climax, he does redeem himself, but naturally so. It's not a sort of putting on airs, and even when he has to essentially engage in heroics in a way, he is still scared out of his wits. That's another interesting element that is atypical even of the genre. Now, the lead character of Annabelle is as I said before, is a passive sort of character. That's usually how the lead heroine that's being menaced in a haunted house story is written and designed. It's essentially a sort of cliche of in and of itself. But what Annabelle West brings to this, and I think enhanced by Leni's generating of energy and atmosphere, LaPlante has a nice sort of inherent charm in the role, and also a certain sort of innocence that makes you, as the audience, very much care for her and fear for her safety. So the film does actually take that into account, and that helps to explain her character acting more passively, because she's very much an innocent type of character, but she has some pluckiness to her in her own way, which makes the character feel more realistic. So everything in this film is totally believable, even though you get into some goofier elements and some elements of comedic humor for reasons. It's never outside the realm of what the opening has set up, because we've gotten the elements of the horror tone and the comedy tone from the onset, and the sense of macabre black humor in the film's mind in terms of the atmosphere. All of that is laid out at the start of the film, so you know what you're getting into. And as you get introduced to all the quirky characters one at a time, and then it's essentially coiling the spring to then, once the will is read and they have to spend the night, the spring uncoils, and then we have further events filled with classic horror iconography, such as the lawyer being menaced by a bookcase opening behind him, and then a hand covered in fur and claws coming out that eventually does grab him and pulls him back into the secret passage, which then closes, and then no one can find him until eventually later on some corpses start turning up. And then the film's most famous image, and one of the most famous images in all of horror cinema, is another secret passage opening while Annabelle is trying to sleep in bed, and she has this ornate jeweled necklace on, and the panel slides open, and then the same monstrous clawed furred hand comes out of the darkness and crosses her face to grab at the jeweled necklace. And it just, the amount of menace in that one moment, and the amount of iconography of the genre in that one shot is just incalculable. It's also interesting to note that as the film goes on, it's fascinating to see how Leni is playing around with mixing reality with a sort of dreamlike atmosphere. So as the events start to increase in not only number but in intensity, our characters get more and more unglued as the night goes on, and that basically moves us more and more out of the realm of reality into more of essentially getting towards at least a little bit of like a screwball comedy energy, with everybody constantly running around and acting more expressively, and their actions becoming even larger because they're getting more and more frenzied as the night goes on. But then also starting to build up the horror elements, especially when you have, again, classic horror iconography moments of a secret doorway opening and a corpse falling out. All of these were, of course, gigantic shock moments in 1927, but now they're so ingrained in pop culture that they're not really going to surprise anyone. It's how they're done, and how the film's energy and how the atmosphere is so intensive. That's what makes it new and exciting and fresh. If you haven't seen the film before, that's what makes it timeless, because without that, this would be a 1922 stage play being adapted to film, and it would not feel timeless in the way that the film truly does. So this is a film that is so completely alive and energized that it takes an already classic story and transcends all of the constraints and all of what would be seen as cliches. And in fact, it takes those cliches and turns them to its own advantage. Because we know those kinds of story elements in 2024, we know them like the back of our hand. Essentially, that puts us on the same level as the film itself. We can see the cards it's holding. The film is a little bit self-aware. I mean, I would say it's truly self-aware. That's part of its magical power. It's just so incredibly alive. And this even goes into the intertitles, which is something that most silent films did not bother with outside of making unique and fancy title cards. But in certain occasions, people took it upon themselves to actually incorporate the title cards and the intertitles as part of the film experience and the film's aesthetic. So there are several iconic title cards in The Cat and the Canary that are not only funny lines of dialogue or memorable lines of dialogue, but the title cards are actually animated in terms of when a character does something and then we go to the title card, the actual title card is alive, such as towards the opening when somebody driving along the road, the old house is referenced, like that's where they're going, and he says, well, he would never go there in a million years, and they ask him why, and he just gets this incredible look on his face. And the title card simply says, Goose! And it's vibrating. There are several of those throughout the film that you just need a few of them. You can't do them all the time because that would be too much, but there are just enough of those. And that just fits into the film's overall aesthetic of being so wonderfully and incredibly alive. And again, I have to bring up the absolutely alive camera. The camera is just swirling through, moving through rooms, doing fast dolly shots into intensive close-ups, incredible low and high angles, point of view shots like you wouldn't believe. There's a beautiful one when the will is being read and everyone's gathered around this ornate table with these incredible chairs that look monstrous in and of themselves in front of the great fireplace, and the portrait of old man Cyrus West starts vibrating on the wall, and there's this incredible POV shot of all of the spooked faces gathered around the table with the will being read from the portrait's point of view. There is not one aspect of this film that is not just alive and full of energy and can-do attitude and a sense of the macabre and just a charge of just delirious fun. Again, as the film goes on, we move more and more out of the realm of feeling like we're in reality and more into this increasingly frenzied pace. The events start to pile on, more and more of the horror moments start to pile on. So when something as simple as the doctor showing up, ostensibly to give Annabelle her sanity exam, of course, he looks himself like a crazy person, and one has to wonder if he is actually a doctor. And it's been questioned by historians if this was potentially a nod to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, because the doctor himself does kind of look like Dr. Caligari. So I think that definitely might have been intentional. But there is a quite a surprising climax. There is a good resolution of the overall mystery after quite a nice fight sequence, and actually getting to see the cat murderer creature in the full sort of glory. There is a little bit of a shock factor the first time you see the film, because it is done in a particular perspective, and we don't get to see the full sort of effect at first, because we've just seen the furred, clawed hand and the figure all dressed in black. And the sort of face that we see is designed to be as horrifying as possible. And as in most of the stories of this genre, once everything is said and done, or if you saw this in just a brightly lit normal room, maybe it wouldn't feel quite as scary or striking. So it's all about using shadows and darkness and the elements of horror as much as possible. But I myself notice every time I see this, there is even a little sort of feeling of what would become sort of ingrained in the pulp magazine era, in terms of a figure all dressed in black with a cape and sort of a horrific visage and disguise, and even the black hat and everything, of course, makes you maybe flash to the shadow and his mastery of magician's arts and being able to literally live in the shadows. But even more than that, it makes me think of the classic pulp character, the Spider, who would actually disguise himself to be absolutely horrifying looking with makeup and essentially giant fangs, and give himself this horrifying visage that he would use to terrify crime, and would otherwise wear all black and have a cape and a hat. Even though the Spider was patterned after the Shadow, the few visuals we have of the full Spider and his horrifying makeup and stuff, when I see the Cat and the Canary, I can't help but it kind of makes me think of the Spider. So you can see how some of this stuff was floating around in pop culture throughout the 20s and the 1930s, and you can see certain elements kind of pop up in different areas, and of course all the different plays that have been done and the various films adapted from those plays. Now, I don't want to go any more into the actual plot because I don't want to spoil anything for those who have never seen the film before. Again, because the overall style and format has been done to death, and the film been remade several times and ripped off innumerable times, it will seem immediately familiar to those who have not seen the film before, but very quickly you'll realize that the film has plenty of originality of its own, that it's not even necessarily the unmasking or the final ending revealing all of the nefarious elements of the plot that's even the important part. The important part is the journey to there. It's the atmosphere. It's the fun of the humor. It's the quirkiness of the characters. It's how lively the experience is, that the film is alive. And again, to make that Scooby Doo connection, just like with a Scooby Doo episode, it's not necessarily about the unmasking of the villain. It's about the fun to get to that point, and then at the end being able to put two and two together and go, oh, aha, I see now, everything fits. And it's a satisfying conclusion then. So you can sit there and try to play the guessing game of who done it as you watch The Cat and the Canary for the first time, but in my eyes, that's kind of missing the point. Yes, you can do that as you go along, but this is a film that's so involving and alive and visceral that you've got to be experiencing that to just be swept up away into the film. That's how you see this film. And I think most people will be able to do that without even thinking. You don't even think about trying to necessarily solve the plot until the last couple of minutes. So this, again, I think is a perfect gateway to silent cinema for those who have never gotten into silent films. This is a perfect silent film to show children who have never seen a silent film, especially if they're great Scooby Doo fans. They will adore this. This is just, simply put, one of the silent masterpieces. It's one of the truly important silent films, and it is absolutely amazing that it survives and has now been restored in this quality by the Museum of Modern Art and released on Blu-ray by Eureka as their first United States release. So to talk about the new Eureka Blu-ray release, again, this was restored by the Museum of Modern Art in 2022, and I had been waiting 2 years to be able to see this restoration, and even more years before that to even of just hoping the film would get another restoration, because the few official releases and restorations we got before were getting outdated, and when I wanted to rewatch the film, you were limited to basically just the old Black Hawk Films restoration, which was pretty much released on Laserdisc, and then there was a slight updated version that Kino Lorber released on a DVD in 2007, but that's long out of print, and even that was showing its age. So this was long overdue for it to be restored, especially in a 4K restoration. And on top of that, given an absolutely top tier release by Eureka on Blu-ray. So this is, without question, the best presentation the film's had since its original 1927 release. The overall quality is absolutely stunning. They are working from the best surviving materials and did do an absolutely meticulous job of restoring this film. Of course, it being a 1927 silent film, you will have to expect there is inherent wear. We are talking about a film that's nearly a century old. It is absolutely beautiful in quality throughout. especially compared to even the restorations we've had before. And this film was cursed with innumerable terrible public domain editions or editions of varying quality, sometimes with really bad scores, sometimes missing chunks, and again, just from all kinds of different print sources and things. So the first time I saw this film was on one of those, and it was not a pleasant experience. So it's definitely been a journey to get to this 2022 MoMA restoration, and then further to your journey to finally get an actual official release. So yes, while you can technically watch a version of this film, even find many different versions free online or even on YouTube, do not do that. just don't. Also, this is such an extremely affordable release that I'm absolutely adamant. Do not ever see a version of this film that is not this new restoration, unless you're looking at the older official versions, like the old Blackhawk Films restoration. Do not ever bother with any of the public domain versions, because again, this restoration is absolutely stunning. So in terms of where you will see a little bit of frame movement, you will see some little bits of damage that are inherent to the element, a little tiny hair or two, nothing outside of the realm of what you normally see in beautiful silent restorations like this. There is maybe one, if not two, extraordinarily small fleeting examples of a missing frame or two in just one or two scenes. It is a remarkable presentation for this film, especially being almost 100 years old. And it's the type of quality I had dreamed of this film receiving if it would get a new restoration and release. And this is what I had hoped to see on this MoMA restoration. I knew it would be as good as this, but it just took 2 years of hoping that somebody would actually release it. And I'm just beyond excited it was Eureka and an absolutely stuffed special edition, which is what this film deserves. Again, this is a color-tinted transfer. It is beautifully done. Mostly it's using a sort of sepia brown tint, but there's also some usage of blues for the outdoor nighttime sequences, and very strikingly in the end climax and the sort of final battle, it is a very striking green tint. All of this does seem to be inherent to, I suppose, original tinting notes, and it is similar to previous official presentations, such as the Blackhawk Films restoration. So this is basically going far into the stratosphere of silent restoration possibilities compared to the two previous efforts on Laserdisc and the 2007 Kino DVD. The audio is 5.1 lossless DTS HDMA of a new score, which is actually based upon the original 1927 score. That's what the Blackhawk Films restoration did, so this is another attempt to essentially have a new score that replicates the original score. And like the Blackhawk Films score, there are one or two usages of a sort of extra sound effect for particular elements. It's basically just the wind outside and then the knocking at the door. So if you've seen the previous official versions and restorations of the Cat and the Canary, this is basically, I would say it's a more refined and I do actually think it's a better listen than the old score based on the 1927 music, but I still like both, but I was really impressed by this new score. My only little qualm, I have two about the score and its presentation, and this is just my own particular quirk. This is nothing against the release, but I figured I would say it anyway. The usage of one or two extra sound effects, you see that in some silent restorations. I'm not particularly big on that practice. It was perfectly fine here, but I could have done without the sort of wind sound effects used a couple times. Again, they're well done, but it's just my own personal preference. And also, there's only a 5.1 presentation of the score on this disc. It's possible they did record it in discrete, but most silent scores are presented in both a 2.0 stereo and a 5.1 surround version. And I kind of prefer having the stereo option. I just like how it fits a silent film more, and usually the score sounds a little bit fuller, and it fits better for me. I have a home theater environment, and I always check the two if there's an option on a silent film. But for me, usually 100% of the time, I prefer the stereo option, and I like doing that for silent films. So I wish there was a stereo option given here, because that's what I would select. So if I had any, and I mean any, things that I would have liked to have seen on this, or things done differently in terms of the disc release, the only thing is I wish there had been an option for a 2.0 stereo score. But again, it could be that this score was just recorded in multi-channel, and that's why it's 5.1 only. Again, I don't know for sure, but most silent films usually have both as an option. And if this was recorded stereo and then mixed into 5.1, or if there had been a stereo option, I wish it had been here. That is my only qualm with this whole release. The only thing I would have liked to have seen extra is I would have liked to have seen a stereo option. But this is still a beautifully recorded score, beautifully presented, no issues whatsoever. It's quite a dynamic score as well, so surround fans will actually enjoy this, even though you might not think it's going to have a lot of activity. It is really well mixed to be engaging in a home theater, and it will all collapse back down to regular stereo if you don't have a surround setup. So it's a beautifully done score based on and replicating the original 1927 score, and it is a perfect accompaniment to this incredible picture restoration. Now let's talk about the packaging and artwork and booklet of this release. This is part of Eureka's Masters of Cinema line. This is exactly the same style of slipcover they do on all of their Region B releases. This is just their first Region A release, so of course it has no Region B rating logo. As usual, Eureka usually has some spectacular art for their limited editions, but this, I think, even surpasses their usual efforts. This is brand new artwork by Graham Humphreys. This is absolutely stunning. If this image alone does not sell you on wanting to see this film, I don't know what will. This is absolutely gorgeous. And the film had incredible original posters, don't get me wrong, but this may be my favorite overall image for the film, because it actually gives you the horror and the quirkiness and the humor all in one, and really nice color too, that actually kind of feels like the different color tints in the film. And Eureka's slipcovers are beautifully printed, so I'm not really one for slipcovers, but when I know Eureka has done one as one of their limited editions like this, then I'm all over it. Usually what happens with Eureka releases, if you don't get their limited edition, you lose out on the slipcover, and then you just have the standard case version. So I would advise people to pick this up sooner rather than later, because they will sell out and you'll no longer be able to get the slipcover. But you will still be able to get the same incredible disc and regular case, and even the booklet in the standard version. Eureka is really nice about maintaining their booklets in their standard versions. The rear is in their usual design in terms of text and font layout. We have some beautiful stills from the film, and nicely they're actually tinted, which you don't often get on silent releases a lot of times. Usually they'll use black and white stills or promotional stills, so that's a nice touch. And they've done it in a way to where they don't sort of blend into the background. They still stand out beautifully. And then we have the technical information, the runtime, and the list of supplements. So this slides off, and we have the same artwork underneath. So if you do miss out on the limited slipcover, you'll still get the same incredible new art. So here is the case, and we have the same basic design on the back, just without the stills. And then on the interior, we have the lovely disc label, which even has the cat chasing the canary. Beautifully done. For the limited edition, we also have reversible art with the primary original poster featuring Laura LaPlante being menaced by the cat hands, a version of which is also on the Laserdisc, so it's the same image, but this is the original poster rendering. We have Eureka's usual style of booklet, which is nicely done with stills and a nice sort of glossy finish on the actual paper. So these are always nicely printed. They're very well done, and on the back we have a shot of LaPlante with director Paul Leni. I like that Eureka also does this, just like Indicator does, of always trying to find a set photograph of the director somewhere, if at all possible, and put it on the back of the booklet. On the interior, we have beautiful imagery and of course our critical essays. But of course, we have not just one, but 3 essays in here. The first is by Imogen Sarah Smith, which is beautifully done and very extensive. We have a second very well done essay by Craigie and Mann. And then a third excellent essay by Richard Combs. So we get not one, but 3 great critical essays. And I think that also underlines that even in a booklet that's not, terribly long, we have 3 critical essays about this one silent film. That should start to give you an idea, if my babbling hasn't already, just how influential and important this film is. And then at the end, as always, Eureka includes viewing notes and the credits for the release. And I do love that they always add this little viewing note so people can ensure they don't have any image stretching or zooming and cropping on their screens, and a reminder to disable any sort of motion interpolation. Now, in terms of the supplements, this is quite loaded with supplements. So to start, we of course have the 4K restoration by the Museum of Modern Art. We have the new score based on the original in DTS HDMI 5.1. We have the first of 2 brand new commentaries. The first is with Stephen Jones and Kim Newman, who are one of the great double acts of classic horror film scholars who have done many classic horror tracks and other commentaries for Eureka primarily and others. So they are no strangers to us classic horror geeks. They just have one of their absolute usual wonderful conversations going through so much about the production history and importance of this film. And so that in and of itself will be a great commentary. But no, we have a second one from another double act incredible pair of legendary classic horror historians, this time with Jonathan Rigby and Kevin Lyons, who have done many classic horror and other film audio commentaries for Eureka and others. Both pairs have done many commentaries for the Eureka releases of Universal horror films that had specific Eureka sets and Region B that competed with the Shout volumes here in the US. So if you've gotten any of the Eureka volumes or wondered about the exclusive extras from those, these 2 commentaries are very much in the same style as the excellent commentaries in the Eureka Universal horror sets. But they give another incredible commentary. And what's great about this is you've got different perspectives from different sets of historians. They play off of each other really well, so it's a nice double act in each commentary. But the commentaries don't really overlap. They have plenty of different information in each that both are essential, outstanding commentaries. So you're getting 2 for the price of 1. And yes, the film's under 90 minutes, but essentially that's almost 3 hours of additional supplements of extreme critical analysis and information that's delivered in a very entertaining, easy to understand style that's also nice, warm, and friendly to those who wouldn't necessarily maybe get into information about the silent cinema. So again, you're getting 2 outstanding commentaries for the price of 1. Then we have a piece entitled Mysteries Mean Dark Corners, which is a new video essay by David Cairns and Fiona Watson. This runs basically 30 minutes long and is a fascinating exploration of the history of the film, the world of the film, development of the film, and is done in a nice way that there's a lot of quotes and things that are read by different people, so it's kind of performed in a sense. And for those of us classic horror nerds, there's an extra very poignant bit because there's a quote actually read by David J. Schall, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. So I had no idea this was there, and I'm watching the supplement and really enjoying it, and then suddenly that I heard his unmistakable voice come on, and that got me all kind of emotional for a minute, and that was just a nice, a completely unexpected little surprise tucked away in here. So that's an extra note for classic horror film fans and fans of the various classic horror historians. But again, it would be enough if there were just the one commentary, let alone 2, but then an entire 30-minute video essay about essentially the entire world of the film. That is expertly done. Then we have two short but well done critical pieces. The first is Pamela Hutchinson on The Cat and the Canary, which is Hutchinson's thoughts on the film and its place in the genre and its long-lasting importance. Then we have critic Fong Lee talking about The Cat and the Canary. So again, you're getting an entire second critical appreciation for the film, which again, all of this is just further underlining how important this film is, that we're still going through the supplements and got not one but two additional critical appreciations. Then for those who are curious about the original play upon which the film is based, we have a piece entitled A Very Eccentric Man and Yeah, a Cat, which are read and essentially performed little extracts from the original John Willard play, again produced by David Cairns. And what's really fun about the extras Cairns produced for this release, he made custom credits sort of based off of the iconic hand wiping away the dust and cobwebs of the actual film titles, but even mimics the iconic Universal A Good Cast is Worth Repeating, which you get a version of in the film at the end credits. He does that for all of those who worked on the project or contributed voices and stuff. So that's another lovely little touch. That's a nice sort of note for all of us classic horror and Universal geeks. And then amusingly, we get a piece entitled Lucky Strike, which is the rather amusing and definitely today slightly disquieting, shall we say, advertisement for Lucky Strike cigarettes, where director Paul Leni was basically, saying that's what got me through the making of this film, were these great cigarettes. And it's very much a striking example of a cigarette advertising of the time, tying in with the production of a film, which is fascinating in and of itself. But one must unfortunately think on a down note that if he did really smoke a bunch of Lucky Strikes, maybe that didn't help his health all that much. And then we close out with the custom artwork and the reversible sleeve of the limited edition and the wonderful booklet. So that is Eureka's Blu-ray release of the MoMA restoration of the 1927 Paul Leni directed masterpiece, The Cat and the Canary, for my money, one of the most important, groundbreaking, influential silent films ever made, and a silent masterpiece that should be seen by everyone, and now can be seen by everyone in incredible quality and a stupendous Blu-ray release for an absurd bargain. Currently, this is retailing for under $20 at Amazon and certain other retailers, which means they're practically giving this away. This is one of the releases that I think belongs in the collection of anyone with a Blu-ray player. The amount of supplements alone really seals the deal in terms of overall value, having hours upon hours of fantastic supplements, which are all excellent, including 2 feature commentaries, and this being an incredible restoration that a lot of silent fans, and myself included, have been hoping to see for a long time, and then waiting an extra 2 years to be able to actually see it, because it took 2 years for this to actually get a physical media release. But it was worth the wait, because I also must stress that every single aspect of this release is absolutely top tier in terms of effort, and the disc encoding is phenomenal. Every element of this release has the utmost care put into it. It's exactly the same thing we've seen in past releases from the Eureka label, especially in terms of their classic releases and their releases of new restorations of the Universal horror canon, but also of silent cinema. And it's fantastic that this is their entry into the US market with, I think, one of the best Blu-rays ever made. It is that well done, and at the absurdly cheap price. This is one of the titles that I will definitely be purchasing extra copies of to give as gifts to hopefully encourage people to watch silent films. I know people who know me, I kind of drive them crazy because I'm always thrusting films for them to watch, or saying, hey, you need to watch this, or I give films as gifts too much. But this is one of those where I definitely would, because it's not only affordable, but it's a great gateway to silent cinema, and it's one of the silent masterpieces, and anybody will enjoy this film. And you get such an incredible wealth of supplements. And at $20, it's fantastic, but under $20 in some places, again, they are giving this away. If anything I have said at least sounds remotely interesting, or you're curious to check out the influence of this film, or see for yourself how incredibly powerful an experience that The Cat and the Canary still remains in 2024, you owe it to yourself to pick up this release, and also support Eureka entering into the U.S. market. So they have done a stellar job. This was a perfect choice to enter the US market with, and this is an essential title for anyone who calls himself a horror fan, because this is one of the immortal silent horror landmarks in so many different ways. Even though it is really more of a horror comedy, it's also pioneering a lot of those elements that not only became ingrained in pop culture and obviously form a lot of Scooby Doo and other things we love, but also pioneering a lot of the blending of horror and comedy. And if you're curious to see the 1939 remake, Eureka has also released that film along with its sister film, The Ghostbreakers, but that, like their releases of Waxworks and The Man Who Laughs and The Last Warning, are Region B titles, so you will need a region-free Blu-ray player if you're in the US, but Eureka is one of the labels I got a region-free player for, so I would strongly recommend doing that. But now, with their newer releases from this point onward, you'll have the ability to view those titles in Region A without having to worry about getting a region-free player. As far as a physical media release is concerned, again, I think this is one of the best Blu-rays ever made. It's absolutely perfect all around, and the new artwork, the disc encoding, the booklet essays, the supplemental features, this is absolutely stuffed, and at $20 or less, they are giving this away. This is one of the titles that, again, I must stress, if you have a Blu-ray player and this sounds even remotely interesting, just pick up a copy of this. It is dirt cheap. You will not regret it, and it is truly timeless, and it's a film you can return to again and again and again, or watch with other people. It's a very fun film to watch with other people, especially ones who have never seen it before, and maybe get them interested in the early days of the building blocks of classic horror, or even get them hopefully into silent cinema if they aren't already. This is the type of release that gets you inspired about physical media again, in terms of what physical media can be, and that a release can be exceptional across the board in every area and not cost a ton of money and not have a premium price tag, and sometimes be so well done and so perfectly executed and absurdly cheap that it gets you excited about things again, in terms of we're in a day and age where studios and entities aren't necessarily putting care into physical media releases in the way that they should, and not taking care of films properly, and not worrying about having good supplements and good disc encoding. So this is one of those releases that makes me hopeful for the future of film preservation and physical media again. And I can say without question, this is already a contender for Disc of the Year for 2024. It is sublime. It is a perfect release of a miraculous restoration of one of the great silent films, a film whose legacy and influence, when you start to look into it, is just so vast. You could hardly even comprehended. And it's a testament to the genius of Paul Leni, who should be a household name, and who unfortunately died far too young and was a truly great cinematic visionary. And you can truly feel that throughout The Cat and the Canary and his other surviving films, which all have been released in Region B by Eureka from beautiful restorations. So if you love The Cat and the Canary, please go and check out those Eureka releases and import them, even though they're Region B. They are essential, especially The Man Who Laughs. So all of the surviving Leni films are masterworks of the silent medium, but it's fantastic to finally have The Cat and the Canary join the others in a beautiful Eureka release from a gorgeous restoration that I've hoped to see for years finally happen, and now it finally has. So hopefully, maybe one day, if I don't get potentially driven mad by someone who's after the non-existent millions that I wish I had to afford more disc releases, maybe the long-lost version of the Chinese Parrot might turn up, and we can finally have all of Paul Leni's American films for Universal available to actually see. That is, of course, the one that got away. And maybe even, fingers crossed, someday we might see both versions of the Cat Creeps sound remake, both the English and Spanish versions turn up, because anything's possible. But those are just three tantalizing extra elements of the Cat and the Canary and Paul Leni story that could possibly come to fruition someday. But until then, this is an absolutely staggering, beautiful presentation of a silent masterpiece, one of the great films, one of the truly enormously influential films that fundamentally set some of the building blocks of the horror genre. It's one of the most important developmental films for the horror genre, if only for being the most important developmental film for what became the Universal horror canon, of course, 4 years before Dracula. And had Leni lived longer, he very likely would have made Dracula and further altered the course of the developing horror genre. So, as always, I hope my babbles about the world of silent cinema, of classic horror films, and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I truly hope I've been able to convince you to try out the Eureka release of The Cat and the Canary. It is truly that important. It is a timeless work of art that is so incredibly enjoyable. So just because it's a silent film, don't let that discourage you from trying it if you're not someone who might typically be interested in a silent film. It is so incredibly vivid and alive that it charms you to no end, and it is so full of such a creative use of every element of the cinematic medium that it is unbelievably inspirational if you're interested in the making of films and film technique. It's a film you can study endlessly, every single shot and element of it, because every element is really working at the peak of its ability and going beyond that. This is atypical of other films of the period, and shows how much of a genius Paul Leni was, and shows all of his promise and potential and artistic creativity that really underlines how sad it was that he only was able to make 4 films before he died when he came over to the States. But this is just, it's a landmark. It's a landmark for the development of the horror genre, and Eureka has taken the MoMA restoration and produced a sublime physical media release. Again, this is one of the best Blu-rays ever made. I put it in that very select little pantheon group of disc releases that are worth their weight in gold, and that is topped off by the incredible artwork, Booklet, and the substantial amount of supplements that really go into the world of the film, the making of the film, and why it's so truly important and iconic. So as always, please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.